In the 80s, Christianity was going through something of an identity crisis. It was lame. Super lame. Stereotypes of Christians generally fell into that sort of Ned Flanders pencil-neck goody two-shoes vibe, and the goth and metal crowd was getting darker and more extreme in response to the Bush and Reagan-era moral majority hyper-panic. It was an arms race between teens and young adults and their Reagan Republican parents who were being fed the same lines by the evening news and their local pastors that D&D was an evil cult ritual and that roving bands of Satanists were coming to steal their children and sacrifice them to gain demonic powers. Sidebar, they didn't exist, so they didn't, and it wasn't happening. It didn't happen. None of this happened. How did we survive 30 years of Chick Tract hell? And in the midst of all of this, the rise of the WWF and the chiseled 80s action beefcake. Your Macho Mans, your Arnold Schwarzeneggers, your Nitros. America's psyche in the 70s and 80s had gone full-on roid rage, and we just couldn't get enough of it. If there's one thing that contemporary evangelical Christianity does well, it's mimicry. I see it a lot in the tapes that I picked to review. Mainstream evangelical outreach is often an exercise in adaptation. They're trend chasers and coattail riders, always looking to sort of become cool by association. They're always looking for their next hook. I mean, remember when Christian gangster rap was going to be the next big thing? I can't be the only person who still wants to talk about DC Talk. But as it turns out, if you're a decent enough public speaker, and you can learn how to break a pair of handcuffs with your bare hands, you've got the makings of a pretty good hook. You see, I collect a lot of weird 80s and 90s tapes. It walks a fine line between hobby and compulsion. One could say that I have too many tapes. On a previous Too Many Tapes, it's not hoarding if I make a YouTube show about it. But this tape is a little bit different. This one is tied so intimately to my DNA that I can't help but make it a little bit about myself. This is a story about the Power Team. Part 1. The Bait. John Jacobs, Jingle Hammerschmidt, la 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 la, is a bodybuilder turned pastor who founded the Power Team in the late 1970s as a way to spread the ministry, drive attendance to churches who ran his program, and make a ton of money in the process. In the South, the separation between church and state is porous, to say the least. And I grew up in Houston, Texas, a place where that separation might as well be a beaded curtain guarded by a sleeping dog who could be bribed with a half-hearted tummy rub. And for those Southern principals who are looking for good influences to speak to the kids, no matter how thinly veiled the Christian message was, the Power Team was perfect. The pitch was simple. The pack of big beef boys would come to your school, do some genuinely impressive feats of strength and daring, and give vague testimony about standing up to bullies, saying no to drugs, and changing your life for the better. A lot of language about people being dream makers versus dream breakers.
We're going to go into high schools like never before. We're going to go into schools all across this nation and begin to walk more bold in the spirit than ever before. We're tearing down the spirit of suicide, the bondage of suicide, the peer pressure, all the demonic influences, the occult, all the confusion, the brokenness, the torn apart of the young people.
There'd be no mention of Jesus. No mention of religion at all, because that would be against the rules, get it? So they'd pump you up with broad positivity like a hot water bottle waiting to burst. But at the end of the assembly came the bait, because as it turns out, this was not the real show. This was a mere appetizer, a light charcuterie board of the Beef Boys, an amuse-bouche of buffness, if you will. I really should have eaten before filming this. If you wanted to see the real show, you had to come to the Civic Center later that night for even bigger action. So you get excited, and you ask your parents if you can go to the Civic Center to see the Beef Boys do the big stunts, and since it's so cheap, like $2 or $3, they agree. And when you get there, there are stunts. But the tone has shifted. Lots of Bibles, lots of church people, and lots of merchandise. And when the Power Team finally arrives on stage, they make one thing very clear. They're here to wage war on the devil.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are the Power Team, and we are here in Atlanta to wage war on the devil!
Part 2. The Switch. Jacobs was always more than forthcoming about his mission, and the schools that booked him had to have been at least somewhat complicit. In an interview with People magazine in 1988, he lays his strategy bare. During the day, Jacobs and his power team have been visiting schools to put on a teaser, ripping phone books and bending steel, and delivering a motivational speech that includes warnings about drugs, liquor, and sex. Then they invite the students to an evening performance at a nearby church where the pitch is religious. I warned the kids that they'll be sharing Christian testimony, says Jacobs. This disclosure notwithstanding, Jacobs' critics are put off by his use of the schools to recruit a church audience. And what about his melding of circus and religion? This generation is drawn to the spectacular, he explains. We're not trying to spiritualize the feats. It's just a platform to share the word of God. It's the bait. Where the school assembly was woefully vague and incomplete, the sermon was fierce and full of conviction. The stunts were more intense and daring, and John Jacobs' friendly demeanor morphed into a more familiar shape, that of an evangelical preacher trying to convert a potential flock. The power team weren't fundamentally different than your garden variety Southern Baptist fundamentalists. They just added a thin veneer of American Gladiators and WWF. As an evangelist, Jacobs was full of conviction, but he had a weird feeling of desperation to him, like he couldn't believe the bit was working almost. He pitches himself as a constantly victorious underdog, but this dog has way more bark than bite. You ever played GURP? It's the liturgical equivalent of GURP. He lashes out at all the areas of pop culture that don't conform to his very specific worldview, like someone falling off the edge of a cliff trying to find a handhold on their way down.
She says, I know how to make you lose your power. And I said, what are you talking about? She says, sit in that chair, raise your arms. Now I'm going to pronounce a saying over you, and I'm going to draw the power right out of your body. I immediately knew she was a teenage witch. How many of you know the occult is in almost every high school in America?
And all of a sudden, we begin making hope deals instead of dope deals. All of a sudden, the peer pressure begins to turn. And you know what? I'm glad that in 1989, we're going to embarrass the alcoholics. We're going to embarrass the dope dealers. We're going to embarrass the users and the abusers. And I'm going to challenge the young people of America to be dream makers instead of dream breakers.
Jacobs' sermon style frequently ventures into a thing I like to call the politician tries to relate. You know when you hear a presidential candidate talk about a man they met in Iowa who has a problem that's suspiciously similar to a platform in the candidate's campaign that they've been hitting for the last 6 months, and you start to think to yourself, the person that this candidate is mentioning does not exist. They have never existed. This is a fake person. Well, Jacobs indulges in this kind of a lot.
A 17-year-old boy lays in a coffin right now under 9 feet of soil with a bullet hole through his brain.
I walked in having lunch the other day, and in walked 5 teenagers.
Dear Nan, by the time you read this letter, I will have already killed myself.
They were dressed in all black, and they had their faces painted white. And I said, what are you guys trying to look like? You know what they said? Death.
Nan, you probably wonder why I didn't tell you more. But I was afraid what they would do to you if you knew too much. You were one of the lucky ones to get out while you could.
You know what I used to think? The punk rockers 2 years ago were weird, silly, strange, mixed up young people.
I went before the committee, and they told me I either had to get deeper or die. This stuff's going on in the high schools.
You know what I think now? They were just young people that were looking for something to be radical about, and the church didn't give it to them. That's what I think now.
I really wanted to accept your God, but your God wouldn't want someone like me. I'm sorry, Nan. By now, I'm burning with my God in hell. James.
Then would come the feats of strength, punctuated by more preaching and frequent calls for donations. They portrayed themselves like they were the crew from Firefly, always just barely getting from job to job. And Jacobs always finished with his signature move, breaking out of a pair of handcuffs. It's a cool trick. It's the first gimmick he learned preaching to prison inmates, the inciting incident of the muscular spectacle. And honestly, it's a pretty effective, if a little bit hokey, visual metaphor. You know, breaking the chains of sin, of life, of bad decisions, and also, you know, like physical chains. I imagine it went over like gangbusters in prison ministry. At the end of the show, had you been significantly moved to give your life to Jesus, you'd come to the altar and sign a pledge card, which would go back to the church and to the power team as a way to justify the cost of the whole endeavor. They'd move on to the next town and do it all over again. And over the years, they made a tidy sum of money doing it. They spent almost 20 years touring the world, preaching the word, and breaking a whole lot of concrete. This tape is part of their Trinity Broadcasting Network television show called The Power Connection. It seems less like a TV show and more like a proof of mission document to help further the venture. It has the wildest montages I have ever seen, with some Tim and Eric level uses of chroma key set to just squealing 80s Christian hair metal. So let's watch that for a little bit.
There's a rain of protection that's showering over me. I've been given strength and persistence, though the enemy will try with all his might to fight. To hell with the devil!
Part 3. The spectacle of self-reflection. The Power Team was, on its face, deeply silly. But that disarming silliness was part of its eerie effectiveness. The same can be said from its primary influence, professional wrestling. And like professional wrestling, this kind of spectacle harkens back to the 1800s, from revival tents to medicine shows to carnival sideshows. And when I was a kid, the Power Team came to my school. And then they came to my church. I was one of those people going up to the altar, giving my life to Jesus. I was 6 years old and all in on professional wrestling. My personal hero, the person that I admired more than any other person in the entire world, was Hulk Hogan. Which, in retrospect, yikes. And to me, it was real. All of it. Every single bit. Even the undead wizard with a small army of druids. There was just something about these larger-than-life heroes that captivated me as a kid. It was physical proof that there were men out there who were good, who would stand up for what's right, who would fight the bad men, who would save the day and then tell us to say our prayers and eat our vitamins. I looked up to the Power Team the same way I looked up to these wrestlers. If they were this powerful because of God, which they never directly stated, but they heavily implied, then maybe there was a place for me. A weird, bookish, strange little boy who didn't really understand his place in the world. The night Hulk Hogan became a bad guy, turned heel as they call it, I was inconsolable. Even my wrestling-loving dad couldn't bring himself to tell me the truth. That the whole thing was an act. It was being done for our enjoyment and our sorrow. That all good characters and all good stories have a turn. Part 4. The Prestige. The feats of the Power Team were fake, obviously. Fake like wrestling is fake. Impressive, but planned. Calculated, and without a lot left to chance. The trick of breaking a stack of cinder blocks? First you bake them to get any moisture out of them. That starts to break down the bonds of the concrete. Then, when you stack them, you put small shivs of wood between the layers. That way, all you have to do is break the top block, and the rest come down from the force of the first. The same goes for those giant piles of ice. And if you know the right place on a baseball bat, it's pretty easy to snap it. Get a deep V going in a phone book, and you separate the pages out, and it's easy to rip it apart. This is what counts for yellow pages these days. I mean, hooray? You get the idea. Debunking this stuff is profoundly boring and honestly kind of mean-spirited. Because at its core, all showmanship is boring. It's the magician's assistant distracting you to protect the secret of the trick. The end result of a magic trick is shock and surprise and wonder. The end result of a wrestling match is cheers or boos and making you want to buy merchandise and come and see the next show. What was the end result of a Power Team show? Well, the answer isn't nearly as simple. Sure, it's recruitment for churches, and that was the stated goal, but now we get into the stickier element of modern evangelicalism. Like I said at the top of the show, American evangelicalism is really great at mimicking, but when it comes to capitalism, it's gone full-on clone. All religion is about identity and community at the end of the day, but with this particular flavor of evangelical Christianity, that identity can be yours for the low, low price of a t-shirt, and a soundtrack CD, and a signed portrait, and a miniature replica bat, and comic books? What was that? Well, we'll come back to this in another video, okay? I think I put that sticker there as a kid. You know what, sticker? You're right. I am very special. The merch? I had it all. I'm genuinely surprised they didn't get into bodybuilding supplements, though. Power Team Power Bars, Protein Pack Communion Wafers, Sacramental Wine fortified with electrolytes. Drink of this cup, for it will get you jacked for the Lord! It was so easy to slot the Power Team next to the WWF in my kid brain. It was just levels of hierarchy. They handed me a ready-made package, a uniform of identity, and it looked and felt just enough like the secular cultural object I already had that it wasn't that much of an issue in my head. So I wore the shirt and read the comic books and watched the tapes. And because I had that shirt, I belonged. Because John Jacobs signed my glossy 8x10 headshot, I was a Christian. And that's where it all starts to get sticky again. It's the part I can't move on from. Because the magic trick of the Power Team can't be boiled down to pure conversion. It wasn't limited to the growth of a flock of saved people. And it wasn't even just limited to crass commercialism. They weren't just selling merchandise to sell merchandise. It would be so easy and so fun to take these guys down on a purely consumerist level, because they definitely hawked a lot of overpriced merchandise. And they weren't just selling that good old-time religion either. They reject that notion out of hand. The old-fashioned religion doesn't get butts and pews. The real sales pitch here, the prestige, it was a worldview. And even in the 90s, that worldview was disturbing. In Sharon Mazur's amazing 1994 academic article on the Power Team for the Drama Review, she puts John Jacobs' fundamentalist, regressive Christianity into sharp focus. The team's equation of masculinity with spiritual and physical power would be unremarkable but for the degree to which Jacobs and his fellow team members are explicit in their repudiation of what they consider to be the feminization of Christianity. They repeatedly attribute to the dominant, i.e. non-Christian culture, the idea that Christian men are somehow less manly than non-Christian men, and then dare non-believers to question their masculinity. In the words of team member Mike Hagan, "What makes me sick is when people say that Christians are sissies." Moreover, the team's display of masculine muscularity is derived from and provides a model of an idealized Christian patriarchy. Jacobs urges men to reclaim their family's spiritual lives from the feminine realm. According to Jacobs, too many fathers have relinquished to mothers their roles as both models and authority figures for their sons. A real man takes his family to church, leads his family in prayer and devotion, and otherwise ensures that the lives of his wife and children conform to a Christian doctrine. John Jacobs' brand of Christian masculinity is abrasively performative and so horrendously limited in scope. But as a young, weak boy looking for meaning, it was all too easy to take influence from this worldview. That same exercise in violent hypermasculinity that I found, and still find, really entertaining in professional wrestling, had been weaponized into a tool of religious conformity. Thankfully for me, it didn't stick in the long term. I was never going to be like John Jacobs. I was too bookish, too weird, I was an indoor kid, too many video games. I was already lost to him, even if I did fill out that little card at the tender age of 6. I was eager and earnest in my heart to believe, but I was too soft, and squishy, and emotional. I guess too feminine for his brand of Christianity at the end of the day. This uncomfortably aggressive form of Christianity has always been vying for power. It lies in wait for the right man or men to become dominant. When folks talk about the army of God, they're usually being metaphorical. These types of guys aren't.
It's time to rouse the warriors. I think God has said, this is the time, enough is enough. And I can feel a rumbling in the land. I can feel God saying, prepare for war.
And every army needs someone to fight, and their target is easy to define and broad in scope. It's literally the entirety of the secular world. Jacobs also engaged in that same satanic panic fear-mongering that the rest of his ilk participated in the 80s and 90s. To him, Satan isn't just a metaphor. He is the literal physical embodiment of evil who is actively working on this earth with his army of followers trying to destroy everything that's good and righteous in the world in the name of the devil and Slayer and Harry Potter. And John Jacobs wanted your help to fight that war on the devil. Because now you've bought in. Now you've chosen the brand. Now it's easier to sell you on the harder stuff, the weirder stuff, the stuff that doesn't really sound right if you haven't already said yes. The stuff that further isolates you from the world at large, and further enriches people like John Jacobs. If you want a good example of that mindset, I told my very Christian mother that I was going to be making a video on John Jacobs, and she warned me to not make anything that would go against God. And that's how these preachers worm their way in. These hucksters have become paid middlemen between believers and their personal faith. That's how deeply capitalism and evangelicalism are intertwined at this point. The business of faith is booming, and if you happen to make a whole lot of money off of your good deeds, well then that's just God's will. And you deserved it. And you earned it. And God wants you to be happy and prosper. Part 5. Breaking the chains. I think that's why I review these old Christian tapes. They were and still are an enormous industry. And it's so easy to pass them off as hokey and stupid and amateurish because a lot of them are. But they also act as tools of isolation, loneliness, and control that were often created by greedy people posing as pious in order to make a couple of bucks off of a particularly easy market. To further abuse the terminology of professional wrestling, and con artists, I guess, they're working the marks. And I'm here to expose the business. If I can make some sense out of these relics of pop culture past that had an influence on my generation, then that's worth something, I guess. If I can get at least one person who was raised the way that I was raised to connect these dots together, then this was maybe worth my time. The Power Team as we knew it ended in 2001 when Jacobs was accused of assaulting former member Jeff Oudis. Oudis was one of 24 former Power Team members who formed Team Impact, another group of evangelical strongmen that still tour to this day. The former Power Team members weren't happy with how Jacobs divorced his wife Ruth Ann. There are a lot of accusations floating around there that I won't touch, and tried to distance themselves from Jacobs in order to save the reputation of the group. A new group even took up the mantle of the Power Team from John Jacobs and still tour. In the old days, the Power Team could fill stadiums of people around the world. Today it seems like they've been almost entirely forgotten, felt only as a distant memory of ripping phone books, exploding hot water bottles, and buff beef boys who got swole for the Lord. And what about John Jacobs? Well, he's in his 60s now and touring with something called John Jacobs' Next Generation Power Force. Doesn't really roll off the tongue, does it? Gone are the days of flashy TV shows and international tours to crowds of tens of thousands. Now it's just him and a few bodybuilders touring churches. And these bodybuilders are less Hulk Hogan and more burly guys who lift. He's more MC than active participant now, and the feats of strength from his small group of strongmen are less flashy, less hyped, more intimate. And for good reason. The venues are smaller. They're not drawing crowds the way they used to. They can maybe pack out a suburban church on a Sunday night, but let's be honest, it was already going to be kind of packed anyway. The magic is gone because Jacobs isn't fiery anymore. He seems listless on stage, going through the motions, and it's hard to even find him online at this point. The Power Force has no Facebook presence, their one-page website is full of dead ends and broken links. There hasn't been a news article or YouTube video of one of their performances since at the very least February of 2019. At the time of writing this, I'm not 100% sure he's even still touring. He's broken handcuffs and baseball bats for 40 years now, but as far as miraculous feats go, seems like resurrection may be reserved for Jesus. So why do we need to remember John Jacobs? Why do we need to remember the Power Team? Why? Because we live in an age of strongmen who want to bend the world to their wills like 1-inch thick beams of steel and leave us shattered like so many cinder blocks. Maybe seeing Jacobs laid so low now is satisfying to me in a way. Hopeful. It makes me feel that if we come together, and we know the right pressure and tension, and if we know the weak points, maybe we can break the chains. Nope. Sorry, I need my wrists to edit the video. If you've stuck around this long, thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and hit the little notification bell thing so you know when my new videos pop up. Did you see the Power Team growing up? I want to know. Please tell me your stories in the comments. I want to know if they came to your school. I honestly also want to know if they talked about Jesus, because I know that's against the rules, and I need more information about these people. Next time on Too Many Tapes, I am not looking at a tape at all. In fact, I'm going to be taking a look at the complete 5-issue run of the Power Team's comic book that they did in 1992. And strap in, folks, because ooh, it's nightmares. It's just full of nightmares, and it's going to be amazing. So please tune back in for that. If you have $1 a month or more to spare, I would really appreciate it if you supported me on Patreon. It helps me support researching tapes like this, and also to buy new tapes to make fun of later. If you donate $5 or more, you get your name here in the Zone of Power. I guess you could call these people the Power Team? No? No. Okay. Thanks again, everybody. I'll see you next time on Too Many Tapes. Ow. This is bad. This hurts. Ow. Don't do crimes.